Odin's got tricks up his sleeve we haven't dared to consider.
What if there was someone who could help us?
God of War Ragnarok is going to be one of the biggest games of the year, and all it needs to do is further refine the qualities that were introduced in the previous game. I've covered that in my previous video, and if you haven't watched it yet, I'll link it in the description. In today's video, we are going to be looking at what God of War Ragnarok can do to improve upon some of the aspects of the previous game that, for whatever reason, fell short of truly delivering. God of War 2018 was an exceptional game, and a near-perfect single-player game that gave players an incredible story, world to explore, monsters to slay, and loot to collect. But that doesn't mean that it didn't come up short in some areas. Join me as we look into 3 areas where God of War Ragnarok can improve upon its predecessor's shortcomings. In no particular order, let's take a look at the bosses.
Well done, boy!
Now, the bosses in God of War 2018 were incredible and further showcased the brutality of Kratos as well as the grand scale of these fights that have become notable for the series since its inception in the very first game. The issue isn't within the bosses themselves, but rather the lack of bosses in the game in general. Just like the very first God of War in 2005, set in Greek mythology, Kratos' first venture into the Norse realms didn't quite deliver in the quantity of epic boss encounters that we would have liked. With just a mere handful of story bosses in God of War 2018, although exceptional and always exciting, it felt like the game would have been a little bit more exciting if boss fights were dispersed more liberally throughout the game's lengthy storyline. And to clarify, I'm only talking about the substantial multi-part epic boss encounters here, and not the numerous side bosses that permeate throughout the main storyline and also the side content. Having to fight through the same mini-bosses over and over that occasionally had different colors and skins, utilizing the very same attack patterns and combat mechanics just to get to that next epic main boss, left me wanting the developers to focus a bit more on adding more substantial bosses in their next game. Now that God of War Ragnarok is nearly here, let's hope that the team at Sony Santa Monica have put in the work to add more epic boss fights and rely less on recycling mini-boss encounters. With a game that covers all 9 realms this time, as well as being potentially much larger, including more interesting boss encounters dotted throughout the world would be much appreciated to accommodate the increase to the game's size. This point segues right into my second point. Enemy variation needs to improve. The variety of enemies to fight in God of War 2018 was pretty good, and we were able to fight baddies both large and small with varying complexities to their behaviors and attacks. The problem with these enemies was that there just wasn't enough new enemy types introduced the further you got into the game. The problem, just like the one addressed before with the mini-bosses, was that fatigue started to set in with the constant encounters of familiar enemies, especially the further into the campaign you got. This is typically remedied when sequels are introduced, as second or third games in a series tend to rely less on incorporating all the enemies and encounters of their first game, and instead expand their encounters further by including a more well-rounded set of enemies that include both the classic and the new. In the gameplay trailer for God of War Ragnarok, new enemy types are present here, as well as some old ones, which is to be expected. The extent at which how many new enemy types will be present in Ragnarok is yet to be seen, but it is promising to see some new enemies, and we can only hope that the final game will sport a much more well-rounded roster of baddies to take down. Instead of reskins of enemies who sport different color palettes but contain the same movesets, Sony Santa Monica should put in the work to add new and interesting enemy types regularly throughout the game to keep players invested in the gameplay and add more layers of unpredictability.
Clearly that's Tyr. Traveling somehow. Perhaps magically. But what's that to do with the giants that they should devote a shrine to it?
My third and final point of improvement I'd like to address relates to the story and how boss characters need to have more of a prominent role in the story. Going off of the previous video I made regarding the strength of the story in God of War 2018, the only problem I had was that some of the bosses in the game, namely Magni and Modi, the sons of Thor, and the Dark Elf King whose battle took place in Alfheim, didn't have much exposition leading up to their respective fights. Kratos and Atreus would talk about these figures briefly leading up before the fight, and there are notes and murals to read that give a better backstory to these bosses. But it would be nice to see more of a direct exposition and build-up leading to these encounters. This gripe I had about God of War 2018 was also quite prevalent throughout the original Greek mythology trilogy for that matter, where it seemed as though the developers just put in these boss fights left and right without giving them much of a personality or a backstory to flesh them out. And no, I'm not looking for Kratos and Atreus to shake hands with these bosses in God of War Ragnarok before sitting down for story time to tell the player why they want to harm Kratos and Atreus. I mean, that would be just silly, right? All I'm looking for is to build up these encounters with proper momentum and suspense, so that when the encounter begins, we are amped and ready to open that can of whoop-ass. Think of this like how the previous game built up the anticipation of the Blades of Chaos, and how effective it was having Kratos realize that he needs to come to peace with his troubled past in order to move forward. This moment was expertly choreographed, and the suspense and anticipation for what was to come had an immense payoff, and was one of the highlights of the entire game. If Sony Santa Monica could build up the anticipation of the boss encounters with a lasting impact, then this game will shine even brighter.
Don't you know when to give up?
So, as you can see, pretty much my only gripes with God of War 2018 revolved around the repetition of certain enemy encounters, namely mini-bosses, having shockingly little variation and not just enough bosses. For a game as big as God of War Ragnarok will likely be, this new game in the franchise can benefit greatly by incorporating more epic boss fights, more epic mini-bosses, and more exposition regarding the bosses and prominent figures in the game. If there's one thing I wish could be different about the Greek mythology God of War games, it would be the wish that bosses had more screen time and build up to them. This was mostly remedied in God of War 2018, but there were still clear areas for it to further improve. As this is Kratos' last journey in the Norse realms, it only makes sense for proper justice to be done to fleshing out the rest of the world and characters before Kratos decides to murder the next pantheon of gods. So, what do you think of my list? Would you add or change anything about it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to set those Blades of Chaos aside and gently caress the like button, and subscribe for more content surrounding God of War Ragnarok and other previews, reviews, and tips and tricks videos regarding the biggest games in the industry. I'll be covering more and more of God of War Ragnarok ahead of its release, and also post-release with a review and discussions, so make sure to stay tuned for those. Thank you again for all your support, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.